Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest in the RSAO's series of webinars devoted to the impact of COVID-19. Today, we're very fortunate in having Owen Matthews, a British journalist, writer, historian, talking about the impact of COVID-19 on relations between China and Russia. His first published book, Stalin's Children, was nominated for numerous awards, including the Orwell Prize. His most recent book, An Impeccable Spy, a study of Richard Sorge, a Soviet agent in Japan, was published last year. Today, as I said, he's going to be talking about Russia-China relations. He has spent a lot of time in his career studying Northeast Asia, and he's very well equipped to take us through this particular one. Welcome to all of you who are online, including the many non-members. We're very pleased to see you here. Owen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Well, it's a great honour and delight to be addressing such an august body, although in a slightly strange format. As Michael said, I am indeed a journalist. I spent over 20 years as a correspondent for Newsweek Magazine, most of them in Moscow. And I'm also a historian, both by training and that is my profession. Now I write history books. So we're going to have to start with a caveat, and the caveat is that as a journalist, I think I'm probably better at posing questions rather than answering them, particularly because so many of the variables in the post-coronavirus world are still unknown to us. But having said that, let's also start with what they call in the Foreign Office some SBOs, which is stating the bleeding obvious. And that is, I think, useful when we are in any discussion of contemporary great power politics, particularly the relationships between Russia, China, and the United States. And that is just to take a step back historically and look at the world in 1991. America, even at the very end of the Cold War, was about 5 times larger in economic terms than Russia. And China in 1991 was smaller still than the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union's GDP was about 3.5 trillion in the contemporary dollars, in dollars of the time. China's is about 2.3 trillion. Now today, despite the extraordinary semblance of superpower status that Vladimir Putin has done such an effective job of creating, we have to remember in all these discussions that Russia has an economy that is smaller today than Texas. In European terms, it has a smaller economy than Italy, slightly larger than Spain. In world terms, or rather in Asian terms, Russia's economy is rather smaller than South Korea's and about the size of Australia's. So it's very important to realize that Putin's extraordinary feat of geopolitical prestidigitation that has been over the last 20 years to create the illusion of Russia being a great power, whereas in fact its true economic status and clout has deteriorated dramatically. That said, of course, there are 2 areas in which China and Russia have clear parity, or in Russia's case, superiority, that is in nuclear weapons. And of course, both of them have the UN Security Council. So those are the sort of stating bleeding obvious things. Those are the baselines for this discussion, is that now China is actually has, so we have a story of one superpower, Russia, former superpower, which has failed to keep up with its rivals, dramatically so. And everywhere we see in Russia's foreign policy, a policy that's behaviors that are predicated on maintaining the illusion of lost empire, the phantom limb of empire, the bitter nostalgia of a lost world and the lost power that's represented by the disappeared Soviet empire. There's no doubt that in terms of real geopolitical clout, certainly in Asia, Russia has collapsed. And furthermore, Russia is actually now, objectively speaking, a smaller economy than it was in 1991. It's now considerably smaller and less powerful than China. Now, if we move on to what has drawn China and Russia together since the end of the Cold War, clearly, the wellspring of the Russia-China partnership has always been their shared dissatisfaction with American hegemony. And both Russia and China, going right back into the 1990s, have always opposed the US-led liberal hegemony that doesn't take their interests into account. And the United States has disregarded the fierce opposition of Russia and China and extended its influence in Russia and China's backyard, notably in Central Asia, which is a particular sensitivity to China, and of course in the former Soviet Union, which is like a red rag to a bull to Vladimir Putin. And NATO's expansion and democracy building efforts in the former USSR have fueled Russia's threat perception that America is doing everything possible to undermine and overthrow the Putin regime, notably leading to the crises in the Georgia war in 2008 and the Ukraine crisis in 2014. But similarly, the Chinese government also blames Washington for its democracy building efforts. Rightly or wrongly, I don't have enough information to say, but we certainly know that there is a strong tendency in the Chinese government today to blame Washington for the Hong Kong protests. And certainly there's intense resentment on the Chinese part towards recurring arms deals on behalf of the United States with Taiwan. So in a nutshell, again, both Moscow and Beijing believe that the United States' unilateralism has posed significant threats to their sovereignty and interest. That's been the basis of their ongoing strategic relationship and friendship since 1991. Now, Moscow and Beijing obviously resent American hegemony, but nonetheless, I think they have different visions of how the world should be, or as Fareed Zakaria, my former boss at Newsweek, put it, the post-American world. And I think the key difference in that worldview is the role of China in it. Because I think one could definitely make an argument that the Kremlin would like to see a multipolar world, rather like the concert of Europe in the 19th century, whereby you have many players. In the Russian phrase, the Kremlin has many towers. Whereas I think equally, you can make an equally strong case for China's major strategic vision being the building of some kind of G2 based on a sort of power sharing superpower type arrangement with the United States, China and the United States being the two world superpowers. But nonetheless, for the moment, the basic premise of the partnership, the foremost objective is to end the unipolar world dominated by the United States. And already you've seen some very concrete steps, not just diplomatic noise, some very concrete steps where we see that China has actually stepped in economically with very powerful, with very significant sums of money to prop up Russia's economy, particularly after the 2014 sanction Crimea crisis and followed by sanctions. And specifically, shortly after the Ukraine crisis, both governments forced Gazprom and the China National Petroleum Corporation to sign a 30-year, $400 billion gas deal, which had formerly been stalled for 10 years prior to that point, in order to prop up Gazprom and with it the Russian state. In return, the Kremlin has definitely paid lip service to the alignment of China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union, although neither of those have really led to any kind of dramatic or significant tangible results. Nonetheless, Kremlin has been a vocal backer of both those initiatives. In terms of Central Asia, there's also become a sort of de facto division of power has emerged between Russia and China. And that is that Russia remains the main security provider in the region, while China leads the regional economic integration. So between them, Russia and China have also made considerable efforts to try and reassert their mutual control over Central Asia at the expense of American influence. So let's move on to now how those countries, how the relationship, or how Russia and China's positions economically and politically have been affected by the coronavirus crisis. And I think the basic underlying theme is that whenever there is a major international crisis of confidence in China, China brings its friends and allies closer. I think that's the key theme. And we see that going right back to 1989, because China found itself in the international wilderness after its suppression of the student protests in Tiananmen Square. And that crackdown elicited widespread condemnation from the West. And at that time, very soon, Beijing found an unexpected partner in post-communist Russia in the wake of Tiananmen. And the first strands of those economic, of that partnership, as well as diplomatic support, was that China very quickly became post-Soviet Russia's biggest client for arms, which was an economic lifeline for Russia in the 1990s. And now we see a rather similar situation sort of repeating itself, because with the current global health crisis taking an increasingly geopolitical turn, Moscow and Beijing, I think, are looking to each other for support. So more than 30 years after the Tiananmen crisis, a new crisis looks like it's once again bringing Russia and China closer together. Now, it's clear that the coronavirus pandemic has battered China's global image and its business interests around the world. And the charge has been led by the United States, by the Trump administration, with varying degrees of hysteria and crassness, attacking China and blaming them for the outbreak. And a growing number of Republican senators, you will have seen, have been threatened to adopt punitive legislation against China. There have been several lawsuits also launched. And numerous European governments have also accused China of seeking to exploit the crisis for political gain, because the various efforts that certainly Russia has made to send aid, particularly to Italy, have triggered a backlash. The Italian aid that Italy sent at the end of March, 120 military doctors who and several plane loads of medical supplies were flown to Rome airport rather than, in fact, a military airport outside Rome rather than Bergamo, in order to provide Russian state television with the propaganda victory of filming convoys of Russian doctors coming to the aid of a beleaguered Europe. I think that has generated as much backlash as it has generated goodwill. And similarly, I think China's efforts to provide assistance have also been somewhat mismanaged and has caused arguably as much backlash as they have created goodwill. So I think numerous European governments have accused China of seeking to exploit the crisis for political gain and for sending them faulty testing equipment. And perhaps more substantially than the PR impact, we have several key Asian economic heavyweights who have actually taken concrete steps to reduce their economic reliance on China. And that's obviously is a fundamental, perhaps even existential threat to China's economic model. So Japan, for instance, announced earlier this month that it would offer financial incentives for domestic companies to move their production in China back home. India, introduced new restrictions on foreign investment to prevent, quotes, opportunistic takeovers of its companies by Chinese buyers. And there's clearly a movement to a greater or lesser extent through various European countries to against globalization, and globalization in practice in most cases is basically a code word for cheap production in China. And so in this context of European, Asian, and American skepticism and resentment against China, Russia has, of course, emerged as one of China's few and very vocal defenders on the world stage. And for instance, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has denounced calls for China to pay compensation for damages caused by the coronavirus epidemic. He called them unacceptable and shocking. And he said, "My hair stands on end when I hear such things," said Lavrov. And Putin himself has actually gone out of his way to be extremely positive and supportive of the Chinese approach. Putin said he praised the, quotes, consistent and effective action taken by Chinese authorities in combating the virus. And he declared that the crisis served as, quotes, a further evidence of the special nature of the Russian-Chinese comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, that said, in practice, despite all those conciliatory and friendly diplomatic noises coming out of Moscow, there has actually been, in practical terms on the ground, something of a crisis in Russia-China relations, triggered specifically by the closure of the border. Now, that has had a major impact on tourism, but more importantly, it's been accompanied by a reported series of racially based attacks on Russian-Chinese nationals across Russian cities. There has been a sort of, on the Russian internet, a sort of groundswell of anti-Chinese opinion, sort of in defiance of the official conciliatory line towards China. And the border closure is definitely has definitely affected the lives of millions of ordinary Chinese that cross the border and work in Russia adversely. But that said, the bigger picture, by the way, the Kremlin has also been at pains to downplay that border closure and say that it's temporary and they will still be issuing visas and that they hope to reopen it soon. But just to take a look at the bigger picture, the bilateral trade between Russia and China reached a record high of $110 billion last year. Now, and China has also become Russia's top trading partner. Now, the takeaway from the coronavirus, I mean, the economic takeaway is that clearly the Chinese government is going to have to position itself for a downturn in demand, a downturn in production, and that affects Russia in one very important way, and that is a downturn in China's oil consumption, energy consumption. Now, plus a downturn in its cash flow. And that's a double whammy, a double problem for Putin, because not only does he rely on oil and gas exports to China for about 1/2 of Russia's exports, but also one of the major planks of Putin's economic reform system, or economics reforms, his so-called national projects program, was predicated on massive Chinese investment. Now, the coronavirus crisis obviously puts a question mark over how much of that is going to happen. Now, Putin's national project program, announced earlier this year, is a 6-year program involving $400 billion of investments to revive the Russian economy and, by extension, to legitimize the extension of Putin's rule beyond 2024. Now, that was being complicated by the recent oil war, which was announced pre-coronavirus, which is announced. It was launched really by Russia when Russia refused Saudi Arabia to do a deal with Saudi Arabia to restrict production. So those national projects have been jeopardized not only by the oil war that predated coronavirus, obviously further jeopardized by coronavirus itself. But the question really is, does that mean that Russia will move deeper into China's embrace in order to boost economic recovery or not? I suspect that, frankly, Russia has very few other options because of its geopolitical stance over the last few years, and particularly over the invasion of Ukraine and specifically the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner in July of 2014, which people tend to conflate sanctions concerning the invasion of Ukraine, with the sanctions that actually followed the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner by a Russian Buk missile fired from rebel-held territory in eastern Ukraine in July 2014. In fact, the most serious sanctions were related to the airliner, not the invasion, just parenthetically. People tend to forget that. But the long and the short of it is that Russia has no one else really, no other major global player has any incentive or even legal right to invest in Russia. China is the only game in town in terms of foreign direct investment. It's really the only country that has the economic clout to save Russia, to bail it out, to invest in its infrastructure. Russia's private companies, thanks to sanctions, have been essentially cut off from investing, from access to capital markets. And that's an extremely serious problem if you're a company like Gazprom or Rosneft, because you need to have to invest in multi-billion-dollar projects going forward many years, in infrastructural projects to maintain your flow of oil. And without being able to issue bonds or so on, Russian major companies are in massive trouble. Hence the Gazprom deal in the aftermath of the Ukrainian of the Crimea invasion. Hence the emphasis on Chinese investment in the national projects. So I think one key thing that we can look for is that however squeezed the Chinese economy may be, Russia is looking more and more like a put option for Russia, for Chinese strategic investments, because Russia simply has nowhere else to turn. Now, the converse is also true. The Kremlin announced that it was granting permission for the Russian National Welfare Fund to begin investing in the Chinese yuan and Chinese state bonds. The Russians are also going to co-finance, the Russian government is also going to subsidize major new projects with China once the pandemic subsides. That includes a new gas pipeline to China, an ambitious new railway project, which has been sort of packaged up with the Belt and Road Initiative, that will connect the ports of the Arctic and the Indian Oceans. And also Beijing has immediately already moved to buy up more Russian oil as global prices plummet. China's imports of Russian crude oil in March increased by 31% from a year earlier. And these growing oil purchases from China have helped Russian oil companies to stay afloat amidst falling demand in Europe due to coronavirus. And I think that's actually a rather good, I think that's a very strong indicator of things to come. The shape of things to come is that as Russia has increasing problems selling its main export, oil and gas, that China is going to step in and increase its dominance of the Russian economy. I think, and essentially, since 2014, Moscow has actively courted Beijing to help offset pressure from the West. What the pandemic has done, I think, is to further convince Russia that China is its economic and political future. And China, for its part, is interested in that partnership for one basic reason, and that they need a great power partner, or at least a power partner that does a good impression of being a great power, like Russia, to help it achieve its global ambitions post-coronavirus, especially amidst the growing pushback from the United States. Now, moving on to the post-corona world, how are Russia and China likely to position themselves in the new reality? And should relations with Washington continue to deteriorate, which seems very likely, I think that clearly, as we've discussed, Beijing will put an even greater emphasis on developing economic ties with Moscow. And I think if decoupling between the United States and China becomes a reality instead of just a buzzword, then I think that China will also have very little choice except to look to Russia and Eurasia as possible destinations for restructuring its industrial production. And there's one strategic major consequence that will follow the possible decoupling between the United States and China. And that is an enormous boost to a project that's been sort of simmering on the back burner for some years, and that is de-dollarization. Now, hitherto, China has actually dragged its feet somewhat on de-dollarization, largely because its economy is so powerfully linked to America's. Secondly, because of course China's foreign currency reserves are very largely held in dollars. But nonetheless, it's been clear for some years that if you really want to damage the United States, if you really want to both symbolically dethrone the United States as a global superpower, as the only global superpower, and also fundamentally cripple it economically, it's to remove the status as the world's the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I mean, that is a major strategic coup, which I think China is not yet ready to take, but I suspect that may be one of the outcomes, or an acceleration of that process may well be one of the outcomes of the coronavirus. Because both Russia and China have, over the last few years, taken some initial steps to lessen their reliance on the dollar. But Beijing's low interest in the process has considerably slowed down the process, and tensions are going to change that. Russia itself is not really in a position, because of its relatively minor status as a economic player, to really affect dollar reserves. China, on the other hand, if it moves towards de-dollarization, could actually make a serious impact. Now, the question is, who is going to be the winner, or who's going to come out better from the coronavirus crisis, Russia or China? I think that actually the indications are that I think Russia could end up the loser in a new US-China Cold War. Because hitherto, Russia has previously benefited from increased tensions between Washington and Beijing. But I suspect that a serious Cold War breaking out between Russia and the United States, between China and the United States, could very seriously impact Russia for the following reason, and that is because the more serious a showdown between Washington and Beijing becomes, the more pressure there will be on Moscow to pick a side. And that's something that, despite the sort of rhetoric coming out of Russia, the extreme anti-Russian, anti-American rhetoric that comes out in the Russian media and so on, in fact, Russia still depends very largely on Europe, certainly, for its export markets. And a full joining up with China in a full-fledged economic and political Cold War with America is actually going to be not a winning proposition for the Kremlin. So another issue is that if Beijing adopts more aggressive foreign policy, and we've really seen a certain amount of tensions on that front over the last year concerning the Spratly Islands and so on. Hitherto, over the last 20 years, Russia and China have been very insistent have been united in their resistance to all forms of interference in sovereign countries. And that, of course, has been the basis of of Russia's military interventions in Georgia and Ukraine, that paranoia that the so-called responsibility to protect principle would actually fuel aggressive essentially invasions and military action in the former Soviet Union, in Russia's backyard. So what happens then, what will Russia then say if China begins to behave aggressively in Asia? That is a serious challenge, not least because there's been a very profound I mean, I think in reality unfounded, but certainly psychologically and historically a profound fear of China in Russia. And China shares an enormous border with Russia, going back certainly to the middle of the 20th century. There was an enormous paranoia on behalf of the Kremlin that the Soviet Far East was essentially indefensible in the face of a major military threat from Northeast Asia. In the 1930s and 40s, that military threat was obviously Japan, but now it is China. And there's a deep cultural paranoia of China's expansive territorial expansion and its ambitions in Northeast Asia and the vast territories of the Russian Far East. Now, I think China has no interest or need in invading Russia. That's absurd. But I mention that simply in the context that there is certainly an anxiety that Russia will be eclipsed as a power in Asia, in Northeast Asia, by a rising China. Now, as we know, as outside observers, that has already clearly happened. Russia is a tiny junior partner to China. It happens to be a tiny junior partner that happens to have oil and gas, which are becoming less important, I think, in the world. Not only because of the coronavirus crisis, but because of China and other countries' massive moves to renewables and nuclear energy. But it's Russia is a junior partner which happens to have a major nuclear arsenal, and it's a junior partner that happens to have that happens to have parlayed itself into major geopolitical clout far beyond its boxing, far beyond its weight on the international stage, and as such, it is powerful and useful. In conclusion, I would say that it's pretty clear that Russia and China will grow closer, and that will be largely in one direction, and that is that China's dominance of the Russian economy and of its strategic choices will actually increase simply because Russia has left itself with very few options and friends. Thank you very much. I'd love to move on to some questions. I hope you heard all that. I didn't see any of you, but
yeah, we heard you, Owen. Thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. And
good.
Perhaps I could just sort of kick off with one question of my own. You've talked about the perhaps almost inevitability that Russia and China come closer to each other than they have been. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a sort of bogey in US foreign policy, which they called the Sino-Soviet Bloc, entirely misunderstanding at the time that there was no such thing, and conflating them simply because they both had communist governments. But what you're describing suggests potentially a bit more reality to that concept in the future than there has been in the past. What do you think about that?
Well, in many ways, that actually already is a Sino-Soviet bloc. Certainly in the one place where actually the China and Russia have an equal say to the United States, and that's the UN Security Council. I mean, very clearly, China does not has never supported any of the UN moves to condemn or sanction Russia over its actions over Crimea. Similarly, Russia has always been very supportive of China's position in the UN. The only real point where they actually have diverged has actually been on North Korea, which is an interesting parenthesis to all of this, and that is that the North Korean leadership has habitually over the last generation attempted to play off Russia and China against each other. Kim Jong-un was actually much closer to Russia and Putin than his father or his uncle. In practical terms, I think it's clear that now North Korea is much more closely aligned to China. But if we're thinking about a Sino-Soviet axis, the modern iteration of that has more or less already come to pass. If you ask beyond the UN Security Council how that could work, in what possible sphere, well, China has, in terms of, if you're counting the throw weights in a potential future nuclear conflict, then Russia, with its 1,600 operable warheads, is obviously an important partner to have. But I don't think that's really an important force in real diplomacy. I think that it's really all about presenting a united front in international diplomacy, for what that's worth. China is grateful to have any kind of diplomatic support that it wants, that it can get around the world. In terms of actually sort of major threat to destabilize the world, I don't think that Russia plus China is necessarily enormously powerful and more powerful in practical terms than China on its own, I would argue.
That's very interesting indeed. Thank you. I'll pick up some questions from other participants now. Two that I think are potentially related, they're not necessarily. The first is, do Russia's and China's interests clash in Central Asia? And potentially related to that, what is the likelihood for Chinese asset purchase and settlement in eastern parts of Russia?
Well, those are both excellent questions. It's interesting. My experience as a reporter in the former Soviet Union in the 90s was all the basic premise of our questions or of the reporting, the prism through which Western reporters such as myself saw Central Asia in the 90s was a strategic rivalry between Russia and China. And in fact, as it happens, a very large proportion of Gazprom's gas was in fact and continues to be produced in Central Asia, interestingly. So because Gazprom's exports are in fact falling, its export volumes extracted, I beg your pardon, are falling. So it has relied for many years for its exports to make up on existing infrastructural pipelines that bring it gas from Central Asia. Now, in terms of its of the great game that was played, there was a major disruption in the form of the Afghanistan campaign and the major NATO intervention in Afghanistan. And during those years, there was a major diplomatic effort to throw a lot of money at Central Asian governments and get them on side. There were indeed very friendly noises. The Kyrgyz and the Tajiks particularly were got worryingly, from the Kremlin point of view, friendly with the United States. But the bottom line is, the result of all this sort of great game politics was that, frankly, China could offer enormous sums of cash and Russia could not. That's the bottom line, to put it incredibly simply. China won that game. It was able to build enormous pipelines deep across the Kazakh steppes. It was able to build infrastructure, because gas is all about infrastructure. You can't export gas in bottles or tankers, or you can potentially freeze it if you happen to have a port like Qatar, but basically it's all about infrastructure, and the Chinese were able to pay for that, the Russians were not. What the Russians were doing was basically leveraging, and actually there was rather an abusive relationship through the 1990s on the part of Gazprom, because there was no gas pipelines going other than to Russia, and Gazprom took advantage of that to essentially bully its Central Asian former vassal states into selling Russia gas very cheaply, and that was the basis of Gazprom's business. The Chinese came along and built infrastructure and offered much closer to market value. So obviously the Central Asians chose China ultimately. And also the dominant now security, if you're talking about diplomacy, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is now, although it exists more in form than any kind of concrete diplomatic function, the SCO is the only strategic organization that unites all the Central Asian countries, and not anything that Russia has been able to conceive of. So already it's clear that the balance of power in Central Asia has shifted decisively towards China and away from Russia. Concerning the land and the buy-ups of businesses and land and so on by Chinese people, actually the Russians, I've mentioned a little bit earlier in my talk, the paranoia and the fear of many Russians about Russia, about Chinese coming up and buying everything up. And you see on just a granular level in markets, in street markets, supermarkets, all across the Russian Far East. They're all run by Chinese, they're owned by Chinese. That paranoia about Chinese buying up extends to Europe, of course. In Venice, everyone is paranoid about the Venetians are all paranoid about the Chinese buying up all the businesses there. It may even be true, but I don't think that should be conflated with a sort of strategic desire on behalf of the Beijing government to somehow sort of swallow land and businesses in the Russian Far East by stealth. Although it must be said, as a historical footnote, there was a particularly Chinese brilliant effort at the end of the 19th century concerning the Amur River, because by the time the Russian Empire reached the Amur River, which was already in the 19th century, the 1860s, the border was drawn along the path of the Amur, but the Amur along its length broke into various different streams. So the Chinese hired gigantic armies of workers to throw stones into the tributaries, into the parts of the Amur on the Russian side, on the Chinese side, in order that they would dry up and the border would shift closer towards the Russian side. But and that's a story that's beloved of Russian historians, which is sort of illustrative of the paranoia and the fear of Chinese economic expansion that exists among Russian scientists and historians and people.
Thank you. Coming to the Russian side of this a bit more, a couple of questions really. First, from Alex Forrester, as the value and power of Russian mineral assets diminishes, both absolutely and vis-a-vis China, how do you think Russia will seek to bolster its global position? And again, perhaps related to that, from David Tomlinson, if the Russians see themselves as the tail to the Chinese dog, how will Putin or his successors finesse that to preserve the image of Russia that they've generated?
Yes. So you cut out at the end. Can you still hear me?
I can. Should I repeat that?
No. I heard it. Thank you. Thank you. Those are both excellent questions. It is one of the great mysteries and one of the great achievements at the same time of the Putin regime, of just how they have managed to fight back to a place of great influence and prominence in world politics, geopolitics, despite having an extremely weak economy and frankly an extremely hostile environment in which essentially almost every neighbor of Russia's treats Russia with extreme wariness and embraces any alternative geopolitical affiliation that they can. In the case of Georgia, and Ukraine, it's been NATO and the EU. In the case of Central Asia, they've flocked into the arms of China. The question is how Putin can maintain that illusion. he's done it hitherto by acts of very well calculated. I'm sorry, that sounds a little bit cynical, but just in terms of pure realpolitik, extremely well calculated acts of geopolitical hooliganism and violence, which, had things gone wrong, or had the West been slightly more resolved or cared a little bit more about Georgia or Ukraine, that could have gone very wrong for Putin. But it was a very, it was a gamble in applying Russia's undoubtedly superior regional size army against weak opponents. And the trick was again repeated in Syria, is that Putin's military deployment in Syria was a brilliant piece of diplomatic theater, because all that Putin deployed was 2 squadrons of planes, a very small number of planes. It was about 130 planes in all, and about 3,000 personnel in one small disused airport at Khmeimim. And with that very small amount of aircraft, sorry, did I say 130? I meant 30, I beg your pardon, it's very important. It was about 36 aircraft fighters that were deployed to Syria, and they changed not only the course of the Syrian war in favor of the regime, but also they massively enhanced Russia's position as a geopolitical player. Almost as much, in fact, as the United States investment of hundreds of billions, in fact trillions of dollars in their intervention in Iraq. But Russia was able to buy that kind of PR, that sort of influence or illusion of influence, with a far tinier investment. The reason I mention that is that Putin has been very good at creating a lot out of a little. And that's exactly the principle of asymmetric warfare, is if you are facing a battle which you cannot win in terms of direct confrontation, you essentially play dirty. You provoke your opponent, your stronger opponent, into acts of self-defeating overreaction, or you play dirty. You convinced American voters that you are a major player just by having a team of hackers who we now know seem to have had a budget in single-figure millions. It seems to be about $4 million, million with an M, and they were playing around with the American election and caused a gigantic political scandal, which we're still talking about, Russian hacking in the American election. So I can't predict exactly how Putin is going to maintain that power. I'm just mentioning that illusion of power, but I'm just mentioning that in the past he's been very good at maintaining that illusion with a very small amount of investment of blood and treasure. And I suspect that he's going to, which is another way of saying that actually Russia's geopolitical clout is strongly decoupled from its actual real economic power.
Thank you. It's one of those areas where I guess mere size does actually have an impact. It's very hard to dismiss a country the size of Russia, whatever the economic situation. I'm getting a lot of questions on an extremely wide range of subjects, many about the relationship with the United States and with Europe. And I'll come to those if we have time, but I'm just going to stick for the moment with the core of Owen's presentation, which is Russia-China. And a couple of questions here on two sides of the same coin, more about popular perceptions. First, in very general terms, how do ordinary Chinese people perceive Russia and their own country's relationship with Russia? And more specifically, from the Russian angle, could you comment on Russia's stance on the ongoing treatment of the Uyghur people in China?
Concerning, I could give you an answer about what ordinary Chinese people feel, but it would not be very informed. So I would suggest you ask somebody who has a deeper understanding of China. I've been based in Russia for most of my life, so I have quite a good understanding of how Russians feel. But for the Chinese side, I think you'd have to ask a China-based correspondent. Concerning the Uyghurs, that's a very interesting question, because in fact, in that sense, the Russian government has also been no slacker in oppressing and rounding up, murdering and terrorizing what they perceive to be Islamic extremists. I mean, we do have to remember that Russia fought a very bloody war against sort of a cocktail of sort of post-colonial nationalism and Islamic extremism in Chechnya and Ingushetia and Dagestan, and that continues to flare up. So Russia's Muslim population is actually growing faster than any other section of its population. There's a deep paranoia in the Kremlin about any flicker of Islamic extremism, and it's repressed with extreme violence by the Kremlin's proxies, particularly by Ramzan Kadyrov. I mean, basically the extremely lawless, brutal and kleptocratic rule of a man like Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, is tolerated and encouraged by the Kremlin for the sole reason that they are terrified of any kind of resurgence of Islamic extremism. So to answer your question, I think the Russian government is perfectly fine about the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghurs. And in fact, like many repressive measures by the Chinese government, I think the Kremlin wishes that it had the means and the wherewithal to do the same thing themselves. The same goes for the firewall of China. Russia's been trying to control the internet in that same way, but failing. Same with the contact tracing apps and facial recognition and all the sort of mechanics of the Chinese security state, which the Russians envy and would like to copy.
Thank you. Turning to more concrete things in a way, from Hookie Walker, is there any evidence of Chinese-Russian military cooperation increasing, and what is activity on the border like?
Well, the border for the time being is closed, as I mentioned. The Chinese-Russian military cooperation has been the basis of their friendship ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, and in fact, ironically, through the 1990s, when the Soviet industrial economy had collapsed by over 40%, one of the very few parts of it to keep going was actually the military-industrial complex, and that was largely thanks to orders from China. So for a long time, the basis, the heart of all the cooperation between Beijing and Moscow has been based on arms, and it continues. The basis of the cooperation of lots of the investment is now not so much buying the hardware, which we now know China can probably produce as well, or probably better than the Russians can, but the software, the brains. And that's why there's enormous Chinese investment in Akademgorodok, for instance, which is near Novosibirsk. It's a sort of academic town full of startups. There's a lot of interest in China in technology produced in Russia, particularly technology of possible dual use, military use. There's a complicated issue concerning strategic arms, or actually specifically about tactical nuclear arms, and that is that because China has not been a signatory to any of the agreements between the United States and Russia concerning the deployment of medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles, in other words, tactical nuclear missiles. China, although it has much fewer strategic warheads, about 600, I have the numbers here actually, about 300, I beg your pardon, strategic warheads to America's and Russia's 1,500 off the top of my head. The point being that China has massively invested in short and medium range nuclear weapons. Now, why is that important? Because they have stationed them all along the coast of the South China Sea. And they have particularly focused on so-called carrier buster nuclear weapons. And those are, in other words, up to 1 megaton nuclear missiles, including hypersonic ones. That's going to be the next battlefield in the whole debate about strategic nuclear arms, about nuclear arms in general, is hypersonic, which essentially cannot be defended against. So the question is what can be done to bring China into that framework. Frankly, I think the horse has bolted. China has made a strategic investment in surrounding its coastlines with a range of medium range with an arsenal of medium range nuclear weapons, which are specifically targeted and designed to defend China in case of a naval war in the South China Sea. Now that's a debate that I think Russia and China may find themselves on opposite sides of. Russia has not been able to develop those kind of intermediate and long range intermediate and medium range nuclear weapons because of it's been restricted. It's been fighting against those restrictions. That may be a sort of an element, a sort of battleground of any kind of a coming strategic showdown, or a diplomatic showdown rather, between Washington and Moscow. But in general terms, your question is that the answer to your question is that the economic cooperation, the military cooperation has been between Beijing and Moscow has been the basis of their economic ties and remains extremely close.
Thank you. One question relating to Mongolia, which of course sits squarely between China and Russia. Where does Mongolia feature, if at all, in a closer Russia-China relationship? It's a question from Paul Diamond.
I'm going to have to pass on that because no, I have to pass. I'm not a Mongolia expert. Well, except if we're talking about the 1930s, in which case I can tell you quite a lot about Mongolia, but no, not today. Pass.
Well, for those who might be interested, I am plotting to get Owen back on another occasion to talk about some of the history of this region. So perhaps you can ask him the question about Mongolia then. But in the meantime, and really to close, I think, because we're coming towards the end of time, back to COVID-19, the number of cases in Russia is clearly climbing. In other places, COVID-19 has stimulated something of an anti-Chinese backlash. Do you see that happening in Russia as well?
Well, interestingly, there has been a certain sort of groundswell of internet chat about that. Russians, it's often hard to tell because Russians are so used to casual racism that actually, sorry, I don't mean that to be insulting. I mean, that's actually really true, is that Russians have there's a different sort of framework of cultural dialogue. It's much more acceptable to say nasty things about Chinese people. And in fact, it means that quite possibly there's actually less, real deep hatred there rather than just sort of cultural stereotypes coming out. So there is a lot of chat and anti-Chinese chat on the Russian internet. The key bellwether is official news media, and they've been conspicuously. I mean, there's been a few memes and fake news stories that have been put out by various possibly government-affiliated internet bloggers and resources spreading conspiracy theories about China, but that's definitely not the government policy so far. I don't think that there's any upside to the government encouraging anti-Chinese sentiment. And I think, should it become a problem, I think the Kremlin will use considerable resources to stamp on it. And in fact, if anything, certainly the government line has been one of great praise, and basically that they could, the message has been that there's been a very strong support for the authoritarian approach to coronavirus versus the sort of chaotic democratic approach. And it's very clear which side of that debate the Russian government finds itself. And also, by the way, not just the Russian government. If you read Tim Gardner-Ash in The Guardian today, he quotes a poll by EU opinions saying that no less than 53% of young Europeans place more confidence in authoritarian states than in democracies to tackle the coronavirus crisis. So, I mean, that's really quite a in terms of the debate of our times of liberal democracy against totalitarian capitalism. So far, Russia believes that the Chinese model is winning.
Thank you. And certainly the conspiracy theory that the virus escaped or was deliberately released from a Chinese laboratory is not one that Russia's own safety record in this area would make it sort of put it in a strong position to advocate. Owen, thank you very much indeed. We are going to have to stop it there, I'm afraid. And with apologies to the many people whose questions we haven't been able to answer, thank you very much indeed. As I said, I do hope to get you back later in the year to talk about more historical things, but in the meantime, thank you for helping us take this discussion further forward. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a further webinar next week. You may be relieved to hear that it's not going to be related to COVID-19, and we will be putting out the details of that in the next couple of days. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.